Okay. So go back to where we were yesterday, kind of talking about education in the late 1800s. Move forward from there. Yep. Okay. Did we get into social sciences in here?
Yes.
Okay. So we're saying also too, what also happens is you kind of start to see people apply scientific research or understanding to different types of areas of human conditioning, right? We said sociology, psychology, political science, anthropology are all new types of studies or research fields that developed in the late 1800s, where they're applying newer methods or newer mentalities about science to the modern world, essentially. Yeah, so I mean, there's things like there's new ideas like criminals are not made or not just inherently bad. Like there's a lot of people who begin to try to point out that like okay, criminals are essentially made by the environment, right? Nurture versus nature, and so they try to argue that there should be a lot of reform or help to try to prevent criminal activity. If you have early intervention, you don't get that kind of behavior, stuff like that. That's the kind of things they're going to address. One of the most famous sociologists of this time is W.E.B. Du Bois. So this is W.E.B. Du Bois right here. He's a Northern African American from like New England area. He's the first African American to get his PhD from Harvard. First African American to get his PhD from Harvard in sociology, which basically his research in sociology dealt with the effects with minorities in like slum areas or major cities. So he does a lot of research there. He was a contemporary of Booker T. Washington. So W.E.B. Du Bois, and it is pronounced Du Bois. I know you would probably say Du Bois, but he said Du Bois. Yeah, Du Bois. And it's not Webb.
W.E.B.
It's W.E.B., right? So Du Bois was a contemporary of Booker T. Washington. Both these men become fairly famous African American leaders around the same time. Both around the late 1800s, early 1900s. And in fact, some people kind of compare them like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King later on. So if you recall, Booker T. Washington believed what about the races integrating? They need to be educated first and work their way. So basically gradual equality, not immediate, right? So he talked about gradual equality, not immediate. They should work for it. And he focused more on trade skills. He created Tuskegee Institute, right? He created Tuskegee Institute as a way to help train African Americans to get more educated and to be able to hopefully get better jobs. W.E.B. Du Bois has a whole different perspective. So like he is much more focused on like, you can't wait for equality. So one difference between him and Washington is he wanted equality immediately. So he didn't want to wait. And I think that has a lot to do with his background as being a Northerner versus Washington being a Southerner. So I think the backgrounds there have an impact. But he thought you couldn't have economic equality until you had what? Or political equality, essentially. So you had to be equal politically before you could achieve that same status, making money like Washington was talking about. So they differed there. But he also believed there should be a greater presence of black leaders. So he wanted more African Americans to go where? Not to trade school, to college, right? So he wants more people to go to college, not to trade school. Hopefully creating more black leadership in the country. So he wants full equal rights for African Americans, schools to be integrated, and more access to higher education for blacks. So equal rights for African Americans, integrated schools, and more access for higher education for blacks. By 1900, fewer than 5% of African Americans in the country go to college. So by 1900, fewer than 5% of African Americans go to college, and that's what he wants to change. So not trade school like Tuskegee Institute. He wants more college education. And we're not done with Du Bois. We're going to talk about him later this unit and again later on. So he's going to be prominent for a while. But both these guys were leaders of African Americans but had different perspectives. Washington was much better liked by whites than Du Bois, because Du Bois is talking about having immediate inclusion right away, and that ruffled a lot of feathers, so he was not as well liked. But they were both contemporary leaders of each other. All right, literature and art. So we haven't talked about literature in a while. You might notice from, I don't know, where are y'all in English right now? Are y'all going chronological English?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I skip that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Theory of evolution. Sorry. So, theory of evolution and Charles Darwin developed around this time period, like 1860s and 70s. The species book that he writes about noticing birds on the Canary Islands and how they change versus birds on the mainland. So he develops this theory of evolution. As we know, the theory of evolution has a wide impact on several different areas, but that research affects development of some of these social sciences. It also affects things like, there's a lot of people who begin to argue like advancements of certain people or groups are better than others. So you see some like racial arguments about them developing better than others. You see social Darwinism being developed in this time period too. So I know you know what Darwinism is or what evolution is, but that idea becomes prominent really around this time, 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's not widely accepted by many people because it goes against what? Yeah, Christian faith in a lot of ways, but it is becoming popular in this time period. So anyway, scientific method, theory of evolution inspires people to basically develop these other areas of research. Sorry about that. All right, literature and the arts. So the Civil War is going to have a major impact on people's view about literature and art. Before the war, what was the dominant literature and art format? So that's what an R. Not realism. Romanticism, right? You not talk about this in English? Not really? Okay. All right, so Romanticism dominated from like 18 teens until like 1850s or so. It basically comes to a hard stop with Civil War. But there's a lot of, I don't want to say flowery, but a lot of things that were idealistic and things that might be supernatural or things that may not be, actually occurring. Hawthorne, Poe, Washington Irving, all those guys were, early American romantic writers, right? But then the Civil War happens. Civil War happens, and people really only want to focus on what? Stuff that's what? Real, or stuff that's like could actually happen. Basically, it's not like imagination dies, but it's just like you feel like you can't really talk about those kind of things like you once did. So realism is going to be the new dominant format for art and art and literature after Civil War because of the Civil War. So realism became popular because of its depiction of life very rough and straightforward. So it didn't try to gloss over bad parts of life. A lot of the books try to show people as they actually were, how life can be tough. The artwork was fairly basic, you'd be like a field with a barn in the background, right? No interpretation. I shouldn't say no interpretation, but no weird stuff or flowery stuff. It's all very straightforward, right? So that's realism. The most famous author from this period is Mark Twain. Are y'all reading him this year? About to read him? Okay. So Mark Twain is the most famous realist writer from America who writes several books and is very dominant in the back half of the 1800s. Not his real name. What's his real name? Samuel Clemens, right? What's considered to be his biggest or most accomplished work is Huckleberry Finn. So it's a sequel to Tom Sawyer, but Huckleberry Finn, it's set during the pre-Civil War days. It's about Huckleberry Finn who escapes with the slave Jim, and they go down the river, Mississippi River, and it addresses a lot of the issues of racism and inequalities of the time, where these two guys can get along on the boat, but when they go on the shore, they face all these problems and issues there. So it addressed a lot of the greed, violence, and racism of the time. And he writes several things. We also know about the Gilded Age that he wrote, so he's very influential. I may have mentioned this to you as well, but whenever he was a riverboat pilot, when coming down Mississippi, he said that our capital was the ugliest building he'd ever seen in his life. The castle, right? Other writers considered the problems of industry and unequal wealth too. So realist writers also wrote about the problems of industry and unequal wealth. So other writers also wrote about the problems of industry and unequal wealth. And that's what a lot of realism focused on. Right at the end of the century, so around the 1890s, you get kind of a smaller development that takes place called naturalism. So right at the end of the century, you have a smaller development called naturalism. Kind of like Gothic is within Romanticism, right? You know what I'm talking about? It's kind of a subset. It's kind of the same thing here. So naturalism kind of comes right at the end of the century. In the 1890s, younger writers emerge with naturalism, describing emotions and experience and how that shapes the human experience. So naturalism was where you describe emotions and experiences and how they shape the human experience. So you want to talk about emotions and feelings and how that shapes your thinking and thought process and what you do. The most famous work of this era was The Red Badge of Courage. Anybody read this book? Red Badge of Courage, heard of this book by Stephen Crane? Red Badge of Courage is written in dialect, which meaning what? Like how people speak, right? It's a very short book. But basically it chronicles this Civil War soldier who in his first battle chickens out and runs away. And throughout the book he's basically finding his courage to eventually return to a battlefield and rejoin his unit and go fight again. But it really gets into his kind of like his psyche, like what he's thinking, why he's doing what he's doing, those kind of things. So it really gets into the emotions and his thought process about why he makes his decisions. That's naturalism. So unlike Romanticism that might like make warfare heroic, right? Or paint a warrior as being noble or whatever.
Doesn't show like true.
Right, showing more of a true perspective of human behavior, right? Because people go out in the battlefield, you know, now or then, they're what?
Scared.
They're scared, right? So that's human emotion. So that's what he's trying to show. People aren't just out there fighting because, like, you know, it's their duty and just out there just swinging their swords or shooting their guns and just, ha-ha, huzzah, right? People are scared, right? That's what it's showing. All right, paintings. So painting also reflects the changes of realism with being drawn very matter-of-factly. So paintings are drawn very matter-of-fact, very straightforward. I don't really have anything here, but, you know, like I said, nothing really elaborate. Imagine a lot of, like, fields and barns and those kind of things, houses. Two of the most famous painters of this era are Thomas Eakins and James Whistler. Whistler paints a very famous painting, Whistler's Mother, right here, this painting. So that's an example of realism painting. There is some abstract painting happening right now, especially by the 1890s, but it doesn't become popular until like later in the 1900s. So like some of those guys are out there like, not American, but like Monet and Van Gogh, I can't think of the name. Van Gogh, those guys, they're out there painting, but they pretty much no one likes their artwork this time. It's too abstract and too, you know, surreal and stuff. So they all died pretty much without money, and then later on people like their art, and then it makes money, right? The art makes money, not them. So you go. Right. Architecture. Louis Sullivan of Chicago made a quest for a suitable style for a tall, street-framed office buildings in the 80s and 90s. So Louis Sullivan was a very famous architect at this time, developing some of the major buildings and skyscrapers of this time period. Worked in Chicago. His buildings form followed function, meaning that whatever the purpose of the building was, that's how the building should look. So whatever they do inside, it should be a building that looks like that, whatever they do. So the buildings that he created was form, followed function. Frank Lloyd Wright developed a very organic style for buildings to try to fit the harmonies of the surroundings. So Frank Lloyd Wright's a very famous architect. He's going to design buildings until like the 1930s and 40s. But he believed that a building should complement its surroundings. It shouldn't like stick out like a sore thumb. It should fit in a harmony for its surroundings. That's Frank Lloyd Wright. But he's a very famous American architect. And then your boy, who? Daniel Berman. Who did what? World's Fair. Right? And then who's your landscape architect? Frederick Olmsted, right? Frederick Law Olmsted, right? Frederick Law Olmsted was also a famous landscape architect at the time as well. Then you have music. With the growth of cities, there's more demand for like musical experiences, or just to be able to go out and see things that you're not used to seeing. People have time off in cities, so they want to go to venues that have like bands or concerts or orchestras or symphonies, whatever. So there's a lot more demand for music to be played in this time period. So cities begin to build buildings to do this. Like you would have cities build orchestra houses or opera houses, music halls like Carnegie Hall, right? So cities begin to build places for music to take place or present in, like opera houses, orchestras, music halls. If you were a little small town like Zachary, you weren't getting a music hall. You would get what's called a bandstand, which pretty much is what?
What it sounds like.
It's like an outdoor like structure where people can play, right? Right. Like the gazebo kind of thing. Basically, that's a bandstand essentially for back then. One day we'll get our opera house here. John Philip Sousa, this is where he's making all his music. All his stuff's very what sounding? Or like just what kind of music in general? Very what? Like a lot of like American patriotic, like marching military type music. If you ever listen to it, it's like a lot of dun 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 dun. Yeah, like all that very old patriotic stuff. But you do finally see Americans developing kind of their own style of music, especially in the South. So African Americans are going to start taking their own style of music, combining it with Western style music, and begin to make a uniquely American version. That basically all of our music up to this point is essentially copied from European or European. We don't really have a unique form until about around 1900, where we start to have our own version of music. And what version is that develops in the South? Jazz. Where does it develop? New Orleans, right here in Louisiana. So around the turn of the century, jazz is introduced, where it combines African rhythms with Western-style instruments. So it's African rhythms with Western-style instruments, and with a heavy dose of improvisation, right? Right, just doing whatever. I mean, I say doing whatever, but it's what flows well in the song. Yeah. So African rhythms with Western style instruments with a lot of improvisation creates the first uniquely form of American music called jazz. Jazz will be developing in this time period, but it won't really become nationally popular until the 20s. So while it's developing here around 1900, in the South, it doesn't really begin to grow beyond this area until people began to take it other places. So it doesn't really become nationally popular until the 20s. There's other subsets of jazz. There's like blues, and there's like ragtime. One of the famous musicians of this time was Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag. This is Scott Joplin. This is part of the music right there. Piano. Thank you. So Joplin wrote this very famous work called Maple Leaf Rag. He also wrote this work called The Entertainer, if you've heard either one. If you heard it, you probably recognize them. It sounds old-timey, but it's famous old-timey songs. But it was very unique for the time. They were hot-selling music. A lot of people bought the music to be able to listen to it or play it. So it becomes a very, very popular type of music produced, this ragtime music that Joplin creates. Over 1 million sheets copies were sold as a result. But eventually, things like the blues, ragtime, and jazz will begin to spread to cities like Memphis, St. Louis, Kansas City, Chicago, slowly but surely over the next few decades. So we'll stop the first video.